Welcome to the RideShare Guy podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
All right. So Hansu Kim has been working as a political consultant focusing on transportation policy and legislation in San Francisco for more than 20 years. By 2011, he purchased DeSoto Cab, the oldest taxi company in San Francisco, which was started in 1928 and known for its iconic blue and white color scheme. In 2016, in a move that incited all the critics, he rebranded DeSoto Cab as Flywheel Taxi with the red and white corporate colors of Flywheel's smartphone booking platform to market and promote its technology and compete directly with the rideshare companies. That controversial decision has allowed his fleet to triple in size in the home city of both Uber and Lyft. And now most of San Francisco's other companies have adopted the Flywheel platform as well. He now serves as president of Flywheel Technologies. So Hansu, how are you doing today?
Great to be with you, Harry.
Yeah, I think we should say great to have you back because I was looking back at my notes and it looks like you came on the podcast. I felt like it was only a couple of years ago, but it was actually 2016. So almost 6 years ago in episode 33. So a couple hundred episodes later, we're still here going strong and so are you. So that's cool to see.
Oh, I can't believe it's 6 years. You're exactly right. It just feels like a couple of years ago, but so glad to be back here and so many changes going on. Give an update as to what's going on.
Definitely. Well, I know we've got some big news to talk about with the partnership between Flywheel and Uber that was announced recently. But give us a quick update for those that maybe didn't listen to that first episode, or what's been going on with Flywheel in the past 6 years.
Sure. Basically, Flywheel was really meant to be an application that brought the taxi industry into the modern technology platform. We saw that e-hailing and smartphone booking was the future. And sadly to say, even today, 6 years later, most taxi cabs can't do e-hailing and smartphone booking. And those that have tried have done it very poorly. And so the whole reason for being was for Flywheel was trying to modernize the taxi booking technology to be more competitive with ride shares. And that's what we've been doing over the last few years, platforming a lot of taxis in a lot of the cities in the United States to start doing e-hail and booking for the taxi industry.
Yeah. I mean, I've kind of always remarked to people that, Uber and Lyft, I think I saw something shared the other day that they're about 10 years old now. And it's pretty amazing that there isn't a single app that you can get out in any major city in the United States and call a taxi today when we know just how well Uber and Lyft work and, how much of a network effect and how convenient that is. And I think I'm kind of preaching to the choir by looking at you right now and seeing how you're shaking your head. But I'm curious, how do you feel about that fact?
Well, Harry, besides the technology company here, Flywheel Software, I also own a very large taxi fleet in San Francisco. So as a fleet owner as well, it's very hard for me to criticize the taxi industry, as I always get a lot of crap for it from people. But the fact of the matter is, the industry has been way behind for so long. The quote I always use is that the taxi industry are still dinosaurs living in the tar pits. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but basically, as I speak to you here today, most taxi cabs cannot do e-hailing and smartphone booking for their fleets. And so we know that that's going to be the way the public books a taxi. That's the way that I transitioned my taxi fleet into being able to do this, so much so that I rebranded the taxi company that I have with the Flywheel app to promote that technology, the taxi industry has as well. And I think the proof is the fact that my fleet in San Francisco has tripled in size where Uber and Lyft are based. So the more the taxi industry realizes to be competitive in today's world, they have to embrace modern technology and booking the way the public wants, the more that they're going to be competitive. And so this is all that I've been focused on over the last few years, modernizing the taxi technology platform to be competitive so the public can utilize taxis in the way that they like to book the ride shares.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why I love talking to you and hearing your perspective is for that very reason. And because I think there are actually a lot of positives to taxis, and in a lot of ways, rideshare is kind of coming full circle, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I guess to me, 7, 8 years ago, right, when I first started looking at, the battle between taxis and Uber, it just didn't make sense to me. Taxis seem to be pushing for regulation. It's like, hey, don't let Uber operate in this way, make them operate like us. And I'm here thinking to myself, people don't like getting into taxis. Why would people want, from a very simplistic point of view, it didn't make a whole lot of sense. But it seems like you're kind of trying to bring the best of both worlds to the equation.
Yeah, I think there's a legitimate criticism as to how the rideshare company has kind of deregulated the taxi industry and deregulated driving for hire.
Yeah.
And there's good reason why you want actually strong regulations in terms of making sure those vehicles are properly insured, the driver isn't a serial killer. You want to
Yeah.
make sure that, when you're picking up strangers for money, that you do it in a way that's well regulated and secure for the public. So I think to say that the taxi industry wanted more regulations to make it fairer, so everyone played with an even playing field, I think is legitimate. However,
Yeah.
let's be honest, the taxi industry served the public very poorly in many places. It's not all the taxi industry folks that are the problem, but regulators were very bad in putting out enough taxis. There's a reason why Uber and Lyft started in San Francisco. If you tried to get a taxi in San Francisco a few years ago, it was almost impossible, right? So they did not put out enough taxis to meet the public demand. And quite frankly, now that we see that this technology is what the public wants, being picked up quickly, being able to see who's picking you up, not having cash on hand, you could pay with a credit card that you have prearranged to pay for. Those things have to be standard practices to the taxi industry. And I think you're right. We're now seeing kind of the pendulum swinging a little bit back towards regulated services and maybe some more stronger regulations on who gets to pick up, strangers for money, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, I think that what we're seeing across the board is that it is important to have strong and even smart, or I should say smart and even strong regulations when it comes to transporting people for hire. I mean, taxi driving has always been in the top 10 most dangerous most dangerous jobs, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, right? So there's some serious considerations here. And I mean, I think to the point that you made around, there not being enough taxis, New York City is kind of the perfect example because we know the numbers. There were 13 or 14,000 taxi medallions. Uber came along and they ended up putting a cap on the number of rideshare vehicles at 110,000, right? So there are literally 10 times as more for hire vehicles now than there used to be. And you could kind of argue what that cap should be at, but I think we can all agree there weren't enough, right?
Let's take San Francisco, for example. Probably at the height of San Francisco taxi cabs, maybe 2,200 taxis in San Francisco. The ride shares brought 20,000 taxis. So I'm sorry, rideshare vehicles. So you can see that there was a battle to put out even 100 more taxis, right? And here we have 15,000 more. But the problem here, there's other things also holding the taxi industry back. And one of them, for example, is what I call, we have antiquated technology in these taxi cabs. And of course, you can pay by a credit card today, but upfront pricing, for example, having a flat upfront price so you know exactly what you're paying. When you get into a taxi cab today, most places you still run the meter. You don't know what the price is till the end of the trip. I call it meter anxiety. You don't know. And today, taxis and ride shares are getting closer and closer in price. So the perception, though, is taxis.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Sorry to interrupt. I haven't thought about that before, and the fact that upfront pricing for customers is a very friendly feature. I just had the CEO of Alto on, and now that he's not on the podcast, I can talk a little smack about his app. But one of the things that I don't like is the fact that they don't provide you with an upfront price. They provide you with a range, $50 to $55, and then they have a 20% service charge on top of that. And so I think one of the things that you really don't know, and I got a receipt from them the other day, and I said, "Whoa, that was how much my ride cost." Like I almost didn't remember, whereas that may have been what they estimated, but I didn't remember, and I was still kind of like, with my consumer hat on, I was like, oh, I don't really like this. But with Uber, that upfront pricing is pretty valuable offering.
Oh, it has to be the way it goes here today. I am certain in a few
Hmm.
years, most taxi cabs will have flat upfront pricing. And it is in the interest of the taxi industry, because if the pricing is getting closer, but the perception out there still are taxis are maybe twice the price or far more
Yeah.
expensive. You address that if you have a flat upfront price, and the consumer can now price compare. And so unfortunately, again, that technology in most taxi cabs, you have antiquated meters, antiquated old CB radios to talk to
Yeah.
dispatch and things like this. That all now can be put on a tablet and be software based.
Yeah. So one of the things, I want to start talking to you about is the fact that I feel like a lot of the things that are wrong with taxis, I think are, we've kind of already touched on the technology, some of the metering issues and things like that. But you just mentioned CB radios, right? This is something to, especially on the driver's side, right? Like a lot of drivers right now, they kind of lack that community, right? That sort of exists with a CB radio. I just had on the founder of a company called Stop Club in Brazil, and they've got 100,000 users in Brazil. And basically the whole point, it's a social connection app, right? And one of the features they have is sort of this walkie-talkie type system where you can chat with your followers, and you can talk to other drivers and see what's going on, and kind of get some of that community. So I feel like I would be a bit remiss if I didn't mention some of the positive aspects that we've seen with taxis, and even rideshare or third-party companies kind of adopt some of these items. Are there any one or two things that stand out in your mind that you feel like taxis have done really well, and kind of like I guess you would say not refined but perfected?
Yeah. There's a few things that stand out right away in terms of what I feel taxis actually do better than ride shares. And I'll
Hmm.
go to them in a moment. But that CB radio, for example, and talking, you're right, that creates a community. However, in many taxis today, you have like five different pieces of equipment. You can do the same thing, two-way communication through software now on a tablet,
Yeah,
right? So those
definitely.
type of things, without a
Yeah,
doubt,
maybe not the
are
actual technology, but the function of the technology can be improved.
exactly.
Or
Yeah. One thing that I think is, an issue is that, because taxi cab drivers are actually vetted very carefully in terms of
Mhm.
often drug tested, often can have any serious criminal history. There's some training that goes on, and that obviously varies from region to region, city to city. But overall, it was a very low percentage that there was serious conflict between drivers and passengers where there might have been assault or things like this. So one thing
Mhm.
that I think when you look back at the old taxi industry, despite the perception that may be out there, assault on passengers and things like this were actually very low in terms of because of that
Hmm.
vetting process. And I think people who use our Flywheel app now and so forth, we have a lot of young single women, for example, that are
Yeah.
regular customer of ours that feel safer to some degree in a taxi. And I think that vetting process and the fact that you have a conspicuous vehicle with a medallion number and
Yeah.
that's a commercial vehicle, those are things that I think are positive. So that's the first thing. I do think that taxi drivers have been vetted more carefully
Yeah.
historically, and I think that has been
So
positive. Yeah.
yeah, so I think one thing to push back on, I mean, I guess if I trust your experience as a fleet owner, right? Like you said, you're running Flywheel, but you're also a fleet owner
Yeah.
yourself, and it sounds like this was never a big issue. I think if you asked Uber and Lyft, they would probably also say, that the number, the quantity, right? If they're doing 10 million rides a day, and this is actually their argument, right? They say there might be a number of stories, around driver safety and rider safety, but they're doing literally 10 million trips a day, right? So that overall percentage is pretty low. And I think if you ask them honestly, they would kind of also say that it's not that big of a deal to them, much more of a deal in the kind of public perception point of view.
I have to agree with that. Quite frankly, the way that the ride shares now are looking in terms of a safety issue, in terms of seeing who's picking you up, for example, seeing
Yeah.
their picture, the vehicle number, and so forth. Those things now are things that were never common practices previously.
Yeah.
So in some ways, one can argue the exact opposite. Technology has created a much safer aspect here. So
Right.
despite me saying that, I do have to agree. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a good point, though. Obviously, I guess one of the things that's happened since we last had you on, when we had one of our top drivers, Jay Crater, right, with 25,000 Uber and
Yeah.
Lyft trips, he came out and, did a few shifts, I think a week or a few weeks over at Flywheel. And I remember one of the things when we had him on the podcast, I'm looking here, was episode 89. So actually in between probably the last time you were on and right now, one of the things he mentioned was actually that, he had to go in person, right, and fill out an application and, kind of check in at the beginning of the day, which I think, again, right, like I think think you could argue how much is too much, or, I think that there's an argument to be made that there's like a little more Uber could do, right? I think leveraging technology, maybe you don't need to, check in with your boss at the beginning of every single shift in person, right? But some combination, probably in between what taxis and Uber do right now. Because right now, Uber asks you for a selfie check occasionally, and it could be anyone or everyone. I mean, it's very easy for basically a driver, to share an account with another driver, right? And there's nothing anyone could really do about that.
That's a great point. Taxis should be co-opting that technology for safety and so forth. But what you said here is exactly right, which is one thing that has held the taxi industry back and still holds it back is you have this very long bureaucratic process often to be a licensed taxi cab driver, right?
Yeah.
And you're also at the mercy of taxi cab companies, their rents and how they rent vehicles and so forth. The freedom and ability to basically get your own vehicle and quickly be able to get out there and work is a huge benefit. And what we've seen over the past few years is that where previously you might have gotten a cab driver's license to work extra, make some extra money, or you're in between jobs, or drive full-time professionally, people are now going to ride shares. Now, interestingly enough, I did want to mention my taxi fleet in San Francisco, because we have this technology and because we have a lot of business for them, we may have maybe a lot of former Uber and Lyft rideshare drivers that are also driving taxis. And I think it's very complementary now, where we are seeing that drivers sometimes are doing both. So, I do see the driving community originally as, taxis versus, Uber and Lyft. But today, I actually think it's one community in many ways. And I see this convergence happening, especially with the things we're going to be doing with Uber, where this community of drivers is really kind of one group with a lot of interests that align.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Before we move on, is there anything else you feel that taxis have really perfected, when it comes to giving rides for hire?
Well, one thing that's quite interesting is that the type of vehicles that taxis have to put out are often highly regulated. So they have to be clean air vehicles, hybrid vehicles. But a thing that stands out for me that I think taxis do exceptionally well is disability services. So when we're talking about paratransit and so forth, many places you have to have a percentage of the taxi cabs be wheelchair accessible, right? So in many places, these commercial vehicles have to be not only clean air or hybrid, or now becoming more electric, but you also have to have a percentage of these vehicles, wheelchair accessible. And also these disability programs like paratransit that subsidize transportation for the elderly and disabled, it's only getting bigger. And I think taxis do a very good job of servicing that community. And I would really highlight that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I know Uber has been criticized a lot in the past because of their lack of access, to wheelchair accessible vehicles. I think they've got a wave option, but if you try to call a ride, good luck. I guess, I did have an interesting interview once with a guy named, I believe, Scott Rudin. He was a Uber passenger from Australia. And because of the app, he was actually, blind, but he could call rides very easily. And so for him, in that way, like obviously it was impossible for him or very challenging to get a taxi. But in that way, I guess with, for him and that specific disability, it was kind of very, very much a good thing, that the Uber app existed. So interesting stuff. And, it was kind of cool that we had Jay go out there and try it. So if anyone's interested in that episode and seeing what actually a rideshare driver thinks of driving one of Hansu's, specifically one of your taxis, you can listen to that episode and check it out. But all right, Hansu, we've teased it enough. Let's talk about the big news. I wanted to kind of provide that overall perspective. So I appreciate you bearing with me now, but can you quickly describe what's the announcement that I guess came out with Flywheel and Uber recently? I think I saw a New York Times article that sort of leaked the news, but I think now it's officially out, right?
Yeah, it's a huge news. I think it's transformative of the taxi industry and ride shares. I think we are going to head towards convergence of services and to some degree. Whatever you may feel about the ride shares, they are the number one way the public books transportation for hire, right? So say what you will, Uber specifically is the way most people, it's a verb, right? Most people now Uber this or that in terms of transportation. So they have the world leading demand in terms of customers and passengers. The ability now through this relationship with Uber is now to provide a referral of those passengers to utilize taxis when it may be more convenient for them. So in other words, if you're an Uber passenger and you can now get a taxi where it might be faster, and more convenient for you, this is the whole arrangement. And what's great about
Yeah.
this, the taxi industry, is that now all that business that went away to ride shares,
Hmm.
Uber, is now coming back to taxi cabs to be serviced. And so
Yeah.
it is very mutually beneficial. You have a better supply. You have Uber being able to utilize, this infrastructure of taxis full time that's there. And by the way, when taxis are up and running, coming out of this pandemic, of course, but when all taxis are on the road in the United States, it's about 250,000 taxis. So you
Wow.
have this whole supply there of professional drivers. And I think that gives a much better access to Uber passengers. What's unique about what we may be doing, which we're testing out right now and we're going through integration, is trying to make sure that that passenger has a very similar experience, whether it's a taxi or an Uber. And that's where our app comes in and why we're working closely with them. Our app works very similar to Uber in
Yeah.
terms of you get a taxi, but you see the car coming to you, you basically have an upfront price, and all those things are there. If we can now make that almost seamless in some way between
Yeah.
Uber passengers and taxis, why wouldn't a passenger want to opt in to get the closest vehicle, which may be an Uber or a taxi? So this is why I think the industry is going to
Yeah.
move in this direction.
Yeah, so I've got a lot of thoughts, but I guess first, what are we calling this? Is this a strategic partnership, or what's the official terminology here? What's happening between Flywheel and Uber?
I think this is a strategic partnership. And just to be clear, when we get a passenger from Uber to Flywheel to be serviced, that is still a taxi ride. So we have to make sure we meet the
Gotcha.
requirements and rules and regulations of taxi services. And so I think it might be appropriate to call it, a referral of their passenger to taxis. But we have
Yeah.
a business relationship with them. So in terms of a fee structure and so forth, that's between us and Uber.
Right.
But basically, it is a strategic partnership.
Yeah. So I heard someone say this. I think it was at a conference I was at last week, and I think it was my friend Josh Kopel. He's a restaurateur actually, and so not really involved in the rideshare world. But one thing he was talking about Uber Eats and Uber is he called them marketing machines, right? And I like the way you put it, is that they're world leading in demand. And I think if you really understand that about these companies, it starts to open up a lot of opportunities. Like in Flywheel's case, right? Like what is Uber good at that maybe taxis or Flywheel aren't? It's the demand side of things, right? And so I think kind of like you said, when I first heard about this partnership, I was surprised, but when I started thinking about it a little more, I said, you know what, this makes a lot of sense, right? Like it's kind of like almost I was like, why did it take so long, right? Like kind of like a no-brainer in a way, because like you said, Uber has all this demand, taxis need it, and you can kind of align. And I mean, I guess in the context too of this driver shortage that Uber has been having, it's sort of that makes it even a double no-brainer. Is that sort of how you saw this coming together? What do you think was the impetus, either on your side or Uber's side?
I think you described it very well. It is a no-brainer. You have this
Mm-hmm.
professional infrastructure of taxi cabs, wheelchair accessible taxis, full-time professional drivers that have been vetted, that are properly insured,
Yeah.
all those ready to take business. And so the ability for Uber to leverage that infrastructure to service its customers, as long as it's on
Right.
the same or better level and at the same pricing, maybe, all the better. So I think that
Yeah.
that aspect to me was inevitable. And what we're seeing now is it's starting to happen.
Right. And I think one big change that has sort of happened, that I've seen firsthand is that you said same or better level, right? And I think early on, I think there was a good case that you could argue that, Uber was providing, in addition to all the tech and all that, I mean, they were providing a pretty high level of service, right? The drivers were well paid. And, they remember when Uber drivers used to provide water bottles on UberX,
Candy
stuff like
dishes, I
that.
remember.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think now the complaints have kind of shifted 180. It's a lot more, wow, this car was a piece of shit. Wow, I didn't really like, the experience wasn't as reliable as it's been in the past. But the thing that has stayed true and constant is that you're getting from A to B in other than sometimes during the pandemic, a somewhat reliable manner with somewhat reliable pricing. I think getting from A to B is like 90% of what customers care about. What do you think?
I agree with you here. I mean, the common compliment we get for Flywheel, and people who use the Flywheel app use Uber and Lyft in the ride shares too.
Right.
So But the best compliments we get that are consistent is, hey, just want to let you know that this driver knew exactly where I lived and took me a lot faster and quicker. And I think because you have a lot of part-time drivers, a lot of turnover with ride shares, you have a lot more full-time professional drivers that really know the fastest way to get your route. And I think this is what we get probably more than ever. But you're right, the early perception was, oh, this is so much better than taxis. But now you're right. So I think it's starting.
That's a very good point. I mean, you mentioned the figure that there are 250,000 taxi drivers, right? Which is a lot, but compared to, let's say, if there's 2 million Uber drivers, it doesn't sound like a lot on the surface. But I think you have to remember, right? Most of these 250,000 are essentially full-time, right? I mean, most of the drivers in your fleet, are they doing 30, 40 hours a week or more? There aren't a ton of part-time taxi drivers because there's that higher barrier to entry, like you mentioned, right?
Exactly right. Yeah, the vast majority are full-time, although you do have part-time drivers, the majority are full-time. Okay. And the number of rides they will be able to do as a full-time driver in doing e-hail rides pickups, even at 250,000, is very significant.
Well, I guess that's sort of my point, is that, there actually might be the numbers between Uber and Lyft drivers and taxi might actually be a lot closer than you think, right? Because a majority of Uber and Lyft drivers, because of the way, how easy it is to get signed up and started and flexibility and no commitment and all that, majority of the guys are like me, not that reliable, don't drive that often. It's only 10 to 15% of drivers that are actually doing 32 hours a week or more, technically considered full time. So I bet that, on a total hours or obviously total trips, Uber is doing more, but I feel like the numbers might be closer than some people might think or realize. Taxis are obviously just more of a fragmented market. I guess the one thing I totally agree that, taxi drivers tend to have a lot more of that city knowledge, right? And, when you think about a lot of Uber drivers, one of the big problems is they have to drive in from other cities because they can't afford to live in the cities they drive. So obviously they don't know the city that well, or as well as a taxi driver. Do you think, how would you reap that benefit in a partnership, with Uber, for example, right? If they're basically essentially sending you lead gen, like that's one of those things that's like, it's nice to have, but how do you get people to pay for it, you think?
Well, I mean, when you say pay for it, you mean how do you get Uber passengers to accept taxis?
Well, I mean, I guess, right, like if I'm an Uber passenger, right, and I go and I say, okay, I'm calling an Uber or I'm calling a taxi, right, the thing that I kind of care most about, if let's put ourselves in the perspective of a customer, right, and this partnership is coming to fruition, and I say, okay, I can take an Uber and it's an average of 5-minute ETA, and occasionally now I see a taxi that's 3 or 4 minutes, a similar pricing, right, and I get that taxi. Isn't the ETA kind of the thing that's going to be driving my use of taxis, or how are you guys thinking about it?
I want to be very careful here because we're still developing what we're going to be doing, but I would like to talk about what we think is going to be so innovative. So let me put this idea out there here. What if you as a passenger could access all taxi supply and Uber supply at the same price maybe, or very similar, and whoever is closer that can service you better, and you'll be able to get that. In other words, if there is not going to be a real significant difference in price and experience, the ability for passengers to access more vehicles more quickly, especially with this shortage right now, I think most passengers are going to embrace that here.
Well, that's sort of my point. I think that's kind of like, especially in this moment, what they would care most about. Like, I actually feel that like you guys are doing an even better job, but I don't know that you're necessarily going to be able to take credit for it at the start. Maybe down the road, or maybe, hey, people say, hey, you know what? Every time I get in, I guess this might be a way, right? And we can definitely keep it broad and high level because I know details are still being worked out. But I think that for a customer, like typically, because I get a lot of people coming to me and they say, oh, we're going to provide a company that has better service or better this or better that. I'm like, customers don't care about any of that. They just want the cheapest ride as quick as possible. So whoever can do that, you're getting from A to B. Uber Pool was the perfect example. Drivers, riders, everybody hated Uber Pool. It took longer, but you still got 100% of your destination. It might take 20 minutes longer, but you still got to your destination, right? They didn't drop you off 10 minutes away from your destination. You still got there. And the trade-off for that extra time was a cheaper price.
Harry, I couldn't agree with you more on that comment here. The public wants fast service at the cheapest price, and that is the most important thing for the public. Of course, there's safety and so forth. I think on more of the premium services, there is really an ability to really have a better service and attract customers. But when we're talking about the majority of folks that need transportation, whether it's an Uber or a taxi, they want quick, fast service. They want to be able to know who's picking them up. They want to make sure they have the best price. And so if we see a convergence of Uber and taxis where the technology now is very similar, the pricing is similar, why not be able to have these strategic partnerships that's going to advantage the public? And that's what we're seeing.
Definitely.
I will say this. I think a few years from now, and I mean this, and you know, I've been in this industry from the beginning, seeing all this kind of
longer
unfold.
Than me.
I will tell you that I'm very confident in saying to your audience that probably in just a short few years, most taxis are going to be servicing Uber booked rides. I think that's going to be the case.
Is it ironic that it took Uber to be the one to sort of potentially unify all the taxi companies out there?
Well, first of all, taxi cab
speechless
companies,
for your first time in your life.
Well, it's worse than herding cats, the taxi industry.
Yeah.
They basically, do not really hold hands and go rah rah. You have very competitive taxi companies that have very different interests. But coming out of losing all this business to ride shares over the years and coming out of this pandemic, the industry is going to move to where the business is. And if you can now provide business to taxis, they're all going to now start providing the technology they need to get that business.
Bingo. I think that's one thing, we've done a lot of work, with new companies and entrants, especially with a lot of these, I guess I would say like more of a old school mentality of fleet owners, taxi owners, group transportation, anyone in the tech and startup scene. I think you can kind of convince them of things like this and talk about, with fancy buzzwords like, future value and the great proposition, value proposition and, like sort of help them on the ROI side of things. But I think with these older school guys and gals, you got to give them money, right? It's basically like, hey, here are more rides, here's more business, here's more money in your pocket. And then all of a sudden they're like, okay, these Uber guys, not so bad.
Harry, here's the way to look at it. The taxi industry by and large is a leasing business. So taxi cabs make money by renting out taxis to drivers and making an income from renting out vehicles for licensed taxi cab drivers. A lot of people think that they share in the revenue of the meter and so forth. That's not the case. If you can't have drivers have lots of business, making a good income, how are you going to rent out these vehicles? So they are now realizing they're not going to be in business for much longer, especially with what we've seen over the past few years, if they cannot make sure their drivers have a lot of business. And the business is coming from smartphone booking.
Yeah. And I mean, even on that point, I feel like I've seen a lot of people sort of misrefer. I mean, most taxi drivers are not employees, right? They're 1099 independent contractors, just like Uber and Lyft drivers, right? The only difference is, like you say, the fleet owner either owns the vehicles and or owns the medallions, and then they rent on a weekly basis. Let's say it's $500 a week or whatever it might be. And then the driver gets to keep everything on top of that and might cover gas. And then the fleet owner or the taxi owner covers everything else. But for the most part, it's almost all 1099, isn't it?
That's exactly right. The taxi industry is pretty much made up in two financial models. You have what's called an owner-operator that has a taxi permit or medallion. They can buy their own vehicle and drive their own. And they're clearly an independent owner-operator and, not.
And what percent of the taxi model out there is that? What, 30% or so?
Oh my gosh. So it used to be about 1/3 of the industry was this owner-operator model. Today, it's more than half. So more than half of the taxi industry now are working taxi permit holders, medallion holders. So you really
which is kind of the opposite of Uber and Lyft, right? A majority of, well, actually, I guess now it's the same, right? I mean, like an overwhelming, like when we do our surveys, I think 80 to 90% of drivers are actually owner operators, of their own vehicle, and maybe 10% go through what's basically essentially a taxi type fleet owner, or if they drive for Uber Black or Uber Select, where there's licensing or, some requirements there, it's a smaller number.
That's exactly right. And so that model now is very much similar. However, let's say 50% of the industry are, drivers that rent a vehicle from a taxi cab, but a taxi cab company. And that's the way to look at it. Taxi cab companies are essentially like a specialty Avis or Hertz that rents out vehicles to taxi cab drivers. And for the most part, drivers have always been looked at as independent contractors, not employees of the company. However, as you know, as the rules have kind of changed over the years, there is a challenge now in terms of maybe taxi drivers being looked at as employees as well, just as what Uber and Lyft faced here. However, the person that the entity that is going to be most in jeopardy with a change like that is the taxi cab company that basically, brings the driver on board as an independent contractor. Some will say to hire the driver. So a company like Flywheel that only uses third-party independent fleets, that we do not hire that driver, we vet the driver, and that vehicle is already insured by that fleet or by themselves as an owner operator, we are clearly not the employer of them, right? So that model is something that is still a challenge. As you know, Uber and Lyft, had a huge ballot measure in California to make sure drivers were independent contractors. But this is an ongoing challenge that we're seeing here. But utilizing taxi drivers to service rides avoids this completely, this problem.
Definitely. So we've talked a bit about drivers. So what's a taxi driver perspective, or just driver? I don't know if you've been talking to Uber and Lyft drivers about this partnership too, but what's a driver perspective on this partnership between Flywheel and Uber?
Sure. The vast majority of taxi drivers are very hopeful that a partnership like this is going to bring them a lot more business, right? Again, we're coming out of this pandemic, and although things are picking up, and for taxi drivers, it has been a very rough couple of years, obviously. So anything that may bring them more business is being looked at in a very positive way. However, there are drivers that are very suspicious of, what is this? Working with Uber, some of these have worked with Uber or the ride shares and experimented with it and so forth. So they're looking at a little bit more suspiciously if they had maybe a bad experience driving for that service. But for the most part, we're seeing that the taxi drivers are very open-minded. If they're going to get access to Uber demand for their taxis, they're very hopeful that that's something that's going to be very good for them. And I have no doubt that this partnership with Uber may in fact bring a real resurgence to the taxi industry, where people will now get cab driver's licenses if they have access to this business as a professional driver. Maybe even part-time Uber and Lyft drivers that want to do this full-time may consider getting a tax driver. Maybe they'll do both. So I think that in a strange way, this kind of full circle, as you talked about, may in fact make taxis finally have some resurgence from several years of being in strong decline.
Yeah. Any downsides to this partnership in your mind, or anything that you're kind of looking out for?
I have to tell you, I only see positives here. I see this as a tremendous win-win for everybody. The public now has better choice, better supply. Uber basically has access to far more drivers to service their world-leading demand. And taxi drivers are finally going to get a lot more business than they currently have. So I think in that sense, it's overall going to be well received all the way around. I'm going to put out an op-ed piece here soon talking about it's provocatively titled the coming alliance between taxis and ride shares. So and people are very surprised because they see it definitely as lions and hyenas fighting each other, but in fact it's not the case. And I think that the more we work cooperatively, I think it's going to be the best for everyone. So this is why I'm so excited. I think a strategic partnership like this is going to bode well for everybody. And so I'm excited to platform as many taxis in the United States.
Definitely.
E-hailing. One last thing I want to mention that I think is important is that part of the reason we're also partnering with Uber is because the Flywheel app is a highly engineered app that works very similar to Uber and Lyft in terms of the technology. And what we've seen over the past few years is the taxi industry thinking, oh, we have an app, hiring some kids to build an app and thinking that we can do this too. But the ability to actually do it in the way where you have no latency, looking at the vehicles on a map,
that's a good point.
Thousands of rides going on. It's very, very important to make sure it's a high level of programming.
Well, I mean, I guess one thing we've seen on the technology side too is that there's a lot more options out there to help you build an on-demand, logistics or transportation type app. I mean, I remember when we had on one of the top developers out there for on-demand apps called George. His name was George Grama. He had started a rideshare company in Europe and sold it and retained the technology and came to America and was white labeling it to all these companies and partners of ours. And he was really the only guy out there doing it at a relatively affordable affordable price. And now, if so, I just interviewed a guy and he said, oh yeah, we found these developers in India, which is normally a terrible idea for something like this, but they had built the technology before for someone else. And so it was like their second, go around. And so they literally could get something that worked for, tens of thousands of dollars as opposed to hundreds of thousands or, millions of dollars. But the thing I will say, even with a lot of the top competitors, and I'll basically throw everyone under the bus here, anyone not Uber or Lyft, basically, their apps really don't have a lot of the same. I mean, the functionality is there, but they're not as good as Uber, right? I mean, I used an app the other day from a company that has raised tens of millions of dollars, and it didn't even have the option, to save my home location, right? Like, this is so basic, some of these very basic features. And I know that they're on the product roadmap somewhere, but I do think that's an important thing. Like, you don't want to underestimate the amount of resources that companies like Uber and Lyft are investing in their technology.
Harry, this is such a key point here. I only think there are a handful of apps in the world that can do the technology in a way that is really going to make the customer happy. You're not going to get a repeat customer if you use an app that is subpar. You're just not.
I mean, I think it'll work. I think it gets the job done, but it's kind of annoying, every time I use, a rideshare app that isn't Uber or Lyft, and I have to type in my home. Like, obviously I'm out, I'm going home. Like, how, you know what I mean? Like, I know it's not as simple as I make it, but like, Uber has added a lot of those things over time. So I just wanted to mention that because I feel like that's, I hear people say that, oh, we can do an app as good as Uber. And I just don't think that's an area where you want to try and compete or you'll be able to stand out. One thing that I did want to ask you about, I mean, we see this as one of the top complaints from Uber drivers right now is the high commissions that Uber charges. One of the top complaints from restaurants that work with, the third-party platforms is the high commissions. And you guys are essentially getting into the space where now it's great to have this lead gen. Is this a worry that you might have in the future? Or how do you think about, like, obviously that lead gen is great, but you don't want them charging too much for access to that lead gen because then your margins will hurt in the future, right?
This is a key point, which is you have to make sure that the driver is incentivized to do these rides and are making money. Mm-hmm. So if it's too high, you're going to have, service issues here. What's going to be interesting is how we're going to be pricing and maybe doing this with taxis, because taxis, again, come insured. Taxis, the drivers are not going to be.
Well, Uber and Lyft are insured too.
Right. So we are looking at actually, fee structure and so forth, and we're experimenting with that right now in terms of, what that's going to look like here. But it's a very, very important point. I do want to mention something that, as you were on the previous point, which is one thing also the public wants besides an app that's white labeled, even if it's fairly good regionally or from a city, is most people that use ride shares are business travelers, for example, that want one app when they're traveling from Chicago to San Francisco to Los Angeles and so forth. So having a universal app and a universal brand, I think, is very key here also in terms of usage. And this is what I think is also going to be great. This partnership with Uber allows us to have that Uber brand and world-leading demand being able to leverage taxis everywhere. So we're going to finally get a universal app for the taxi industry, but it's actually going to be Uber now too, which is quite interesting. So I think that aspect is a very important one also for usage.
Very cool. Well, Hansu, I'm sure we could talk about this for hours, but we've got a limited time, and I appreciate you coming on. And I'm really excited at the future and the prospects for Flywheel and taxis and rideshare drivers and taxi drivers. Before we go, though, I want to give you the opportunity, if folks want to learn more about your work or Flywheel, let us know where they can go. And then also, I want to give you the opportunity to ask me one question to end the podcast.
Absolutely. So first, anyone that wants to find more information about Flywheel, they can go to our main website, flywheel.com. And you can.
Or if they want to drive, just like Jay did, right?
Exactly right. You want to drive a taxi, you can contact us as well here. So please check out flywheel.com. We're very excited about this partnership with Uber, and we're open to anyone here looking at what we do. I have a good question for you.
All right, I'm ready.
Okay, as we are converging these services in a way, and I think you and I both agree that it could very well be that a few years from now, most taxis may be servicing Uber Book rides. I want to ask you, because of your excellent experience in the rideshare community, do you think that passengers will accept taxis picking them up in addition to Uber if the pricing is the same? And do you think also that taxis taxi drivers will really embrace picking up Uber passengers. So both those things,
Yeah.
I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of touched on it here and there during the interview, but I think in general, I think that passengers really don't care. I think the overwhelming majority, I would say 90% of passengers, they care about the ETA or the reliability, basically, and sort of the pricing, right? And so as long as you can match or come close to an ETA of Uber and Lyft's, and the pricing is going to be in the same ballpark, you'll be able to take 90% of those passengers. And there might be some weird things at first where it's like, hey, it feels a little weird getting into a taxi. There might be some A/B testing or apprehension that you need to figure out, and I'm sure that's the type of stuff that you're working on with Uber right now. It's like, hey, how do we convince these people that like a taxi is going to be just as great? And I'm sure they'll test a bunch of stuff because it's in Uber's best interest too. If they've got a closer taxi, for example, they're going to figure out a way. It's like, hey, maybe you get $5 off your first taxi ride, or these guys at Uber, if you don't already know, they're pretty smart over there. So I'm sure they'll figure out something to make that happen. And I think passengers really will come over, and start taking taxi rides through the Uber platform in very high numbers. I think the thing where there's interesting opportunity, though, is to kind of find whether it's that pricing structure or those times and places that kind of allow the taxi companies to charge a premium, right? Or not to have to battle Uber, with certain, like, drivers don't like minimum fares, for example, right? So if there's like, normally in LA, it's an $8 minimum fare to passengers, Uber's takes $3 and then 25% of the rest, and drivers get a $2.75 or a $3.40 payout for 20 minutes of work, right? Like, I don't think taxis are going to like that too much. So I imagine if I'm in your shoes, those are like kind of the rides where it's like, hey, maybe we bump up our minimum a little bit, and passengers, we don't get them, we're not open to every ride on the Uber platform, but we're not a premium service, but we just have certain tiny thresholds, right? So instead of a $8 minimum, it's just a little like a $12 minimum, right? So it's a little bit longer. I feel like there's a lot of opportunity there because Uber is a mass market product, right? They have to design a product that's great for anyone and everyone, and certain rides kind of subsidize other rides, right? And so if I'm kind of coming in there and I'm not going to be able to compete with Uber on the volume, I kind of want to think about it in a specialized way, right? What are those rides or those types of passengers, right? Like they always say in business, what's the saying? Like, not every customer is a great customer. Like, some customers are shitty, right? Like some customers kind of suck, right? And so you kind of want to think about avoiding those. And what was the second part of your question?
Well, I think you hit it. You hit it there. I think you
Okay.
you hit it both, which is you're basically saying you think passengers are going to accept taxis picking up as long as the pricing and experience is very similar in terms of EPA and so forth. And drivers, as long as they're going to make money, are likely going to take this business they have now access to. So I completely agree with you, and I think the magic sauce right now with our partnership with Uber is to make sure we address those things in a way so that the passengers will welcome taxis picking them up and drivers will take Uber passengers all day long. And that's
Definitely
what we're trying to do right now.
Cool. Well, I'm excited to see what the future holds and appreciate you coming on the podcast, Hansu. Hopefully it won't be another 5 years before your third appearance.
It's my pleasure always, Harry. Great to speak with you, and I look forward to speaking with you again.